Welcome to Lecture 14, dealing with institutional corrections, so jails and prisons. You might recall that in last week's lesson, I said that probation is the most common sentence offenders receive in the United States, and that's true. But in spite of the fact that 65% of criminal offenders convicted in the United States receive a sentence of probation, and another 10% only receive a sentence of a fine or community service, there's still the fact remains that approximately 1.5 million criminal offenders in the U.S. are in a state or federal prison. Prisons are far more expensive than probation and offer far fewer opportunities for rehabilitation through counseling, treatment, and employment training. Also, another negative aspect of prisons is that while offenders are locked up in prison with other experienced offenders, they tend to become more deviant in their lifestyle, not less deviant. Because of these issues, the criminal justice system is aware of this, and prisons hold mostly dangerous offenders, offenders with lengthy records, and offenders convicted of the highest level felony offenses. Very few people in prison are first-time offenders. Even murderers frequently, you see, get very short prison sentences if it's their first offense at all. So if you've never committed a crime in your life and you commit a murder, you're probably not going to get a life sentence. Statistics from the Ohio Bureau of Corrections and Rehabilitation, our prison system in the state of Ohio, reveal that this is the typical demographics of those that are incarcerated in prisons in Ohio. They're 84% male, they're 55% white, and 43% black. The median age is 33. 34% have less than a high school education. Only 19% had been employed full-time when arrested. Think about that. Only 1 in 5 had been employed full-time at the time that they were arrested for the offense that put them in prison. 80% were drug dependent, 45% are alcohol dependent. So drugs clearly play a bigger role in being sentenced to prison than does alcohol. The median prior total criminal convictions is 7. So the average offender has at least 7 criminal convictions, not arrests, convictions before being sent to prison. 42% have more than 3 felony convictions. 79% had a prior violent offense conviction before coming to prison, not what has been in prison now. 51% had been sentenced to prison before, so half. This is not their first time even in prison. 68% will be rearrested within 3 years after release. 52% will be not only rearrested but returned to prison within 3 years after release. And the average taxpayer cost per day per inmate is $90 as of 2013. I've heard it said several times that our prisons are filled with people who are just minor drug offenders, and that's just not true. Here's a pie chart that shows the breakdown of nationwide state prison inmate populations. The vast majority of people in prison are violent offenders. Now, they may also have been convicted at the same time of a drug offense, but the offense that determined whether or not they went to prison was primarily that violent offense. So more than half of the people in state prisons are there for violent offenses. Another 22% are there for property offenses. And those are not just they committed one burglary and they went to prison. That's unheard of. I've never encountered a case like that. They are people who have committed multiple property offenses in the lines of robberies and burglaries or major embezzlements and things like that. And then 16%, or 16.9% here, so 17% are drug offenders. Some of those are small-time drug offenders, some of those are big-time drug offenders. And then the remaining 8.2 is other, are other types of morals offenses. Those would include people, believe it or not, that some are in prison for DUI, but it's like their 10th DUI and it resulted in the death of an individual. In fact, I have a friend from high school that had racked up 3 DUIs, and in the last DUI arrest, he had ended up killing an innocent person by running through a red light completely drunk, and he's serving a 5-year prison sentence as a result. So this week we're going to look primarily at correctional officers and how they control the correctional facility. So one important issue in studying correctional personnel is examining how they are able to contain and control the behavior of prison inmates. Prison inmates have some legal rights within the prison, but their behavior is also limited by a complex list of prison rules that limit their freedoms. Correctional officers use their discretion to report or not report violation of these prison rules as a way to get prison inmates to cooperate and behave within the prison. So, just like police officers use their discretion to decide how best to handle situations with the public, correctional officers use their discretion to decide how best to handle situations within the inmate population. This is how correctional officers actually maintain control of the prison without having to constantly resort to the use of force every day. It's through their use of discretion of what violations to overlook and which ones to enforce that brings stability to the prison environment. So the first reading this week is very unique. It's a chapter from the book New Jack, written by a guy by the name of Ted Conover. This is Ted Conover in the photograph. Ted Conover is a journalist. He's a very interesting journalist. He got his master's degree from Harvard and his doctorate from Oxford University. And he makes a living of going undercover into different occupations and writing after leaving that occupation for a year or so. He writes about those experiences that he had. He worked undercover, smuggling back and forth with illegal aliens, crossing the border several times, wrote a book on that. He wrote a book on motorcycle gangs, and in this case, with New Jack, he went undercover as a correctional officer. He falsified some of his background and applied for a job as a correctional officer and dumbed down his educational degrees, and was hired as a correctional officer and went to work in Sing Sing prison in upstate New York. And the book New Jack is about his experiences working in that maximum security prison in New York. And the important thing to pay attention to as you're reading it is looking at officer discretion. He gives a ton of examples of how correctional officers can and do use their discretion to maintain order within the facility, and then sometimes how when they don't use their discretion, it creates chaos within the facility. Then continuing on with that theme is an article by Michael Gilbert, an academic who's also a former correctional officer. It's The Illusion of Structure, a critique of the classical model of organization and the discretionary power of correctional officers. Again, talking about how, in theory, how correctional officers are supposed to operate and how the organization's supposed to operate, but how, again, like in street-level bureaucrat theory, correctional officers tend to go around that model and create their own set of rules. And it's because if they follow the rules that they're supposed to be following, chaos would result. So they need to create their own set of rules to operate and function within the facility. And then lastly, article Contraband, the Basis for Legitimate Power in a Prison Social System, written by David Kalinich, who, again, former correctional officer, as was Stan Stojkovic. And again, this article specifically targets how officers use their discretion to manipulate and control inmate behavior without having to use force. So don't forget quiz number 14 at the end of the week. And as always, email me if you have any questions or concerns.